I'm Christopher Bell. I'm the author of Churchill and Sea Power. What I wanted to do with this book was to take a look at the management of British sea power during the first half of the 20th century, not from the perspective of admirals and sailors at sea, but from the perspective of civilian decision makers in Whitehall, and to look at how politicians, who ultimately controlled the well-being of the Royal Navy and determined how and when and where it was used, how those civilian statesmen employed the Navy and maintained its welfare over this very important period of modern history. Now, Churchill was a natural focal point for this study because Churchill, of course, has a very close and intimate connection with the Royal Navy pretty much throughout his entire career. He becomes First Lord of the Admiralty in 1911. He presides over its fortunes again at the beginning of the Second World War as First Lord of the Admiralty, and then again as Prime Minister. And in the other civilian cabinet positions that he holds over the course of his career, he's quite often very closely connected with naval affairs, and quite often has a decisive influence in determining the level of funding and support that the Navy does get from the British state. So what I wanted to do here was to chart Churchill's evolution as a naval thinker and a naval strategist, to show how his views changed over the period of about 50 years. Because, of course, during this time, Britain's potential enemies change a great deal, technology is constantly changing, and the resources that Britain has to devote to its navy or to devote to defense in general, the resources fluctuate tremendously. And Churchill, of course, has to grapple with these problems and to change and to adapt with the times. So Churchill, in 1914, as First Lord of the Admiralty, is very concerned with the threat from the German Navy. He is a decisive, influential figure in terms of British naval strategy at the beginning of the First World War. And then, of course, he returns to the Admiralty at the beginning of the Second World War and has a tremendous influence over the Navy's fortune then as well. So what I wanted to do was to show how Churchill's perspective changes, how the Churchill of 1914, for example, has different views about the utility and the meaning of naval power or sea power compared to the Churchill of 1925 or the Churchill of 1941, and again, very different from the Churchill of 1953 or 54. And the other thing that I've wanted to do with this book was to look at a number of very important and quite often controversial episodes from the two world wars in which Churchill was a decisive figure, where Churchill's views on sea power really had an impact on the fate and the fortune of the Royal Navy itself.